The scar burned before the words even left his mouth. Lyra Ashwood felt it the moment she stepped into the great hall of Ashenfall, a deep, pulling heat low in her chest, like something old and alive recognizing her from across the room. The chandeliers above held 300 candles, and their light caught the gold inlaid into the stone floor and threw it upward in warm fragments across the crowd. Every wolf in the known territories had come for the blood moon ceremony, lords and ladies in their finest, warriors in polished leather. Pups barely old enough to understand what the night meant, pressed between their parents and craning their necks to see. She had dressed simply, not because she lacked finery. The Ashwood line was old, and old lines kept their wealth close, but because she had never believed that ceremony required costume. Her dress was dark blue, her hair braided and pinned, and the single piece of jewelry she wore was a narrow ring of silver on her right hand that had belonged to her mother. It was not an impressive entrance. She had not planned for it to be. She had not planned for any of this, if she was honest with herself. The pull in her chest told her what her mind had not yet allowed. She knew the old stories. Every wolf pup grew up hearing them, the way fate worked through the blood moon, the way a mated pair would feel the bond before they ever crossed the same room, the way recognition arrived not as thought but as gravity. A leaning, an undeniable pointing toward someone specific in a crowd of hundreds. She was pointing toward the throne. Kalen Voss, king of Ashenfall, stood at the far end of the hall and looked like something carved rather than born. He was tall in the way that old bloodlines produced, not just height, but presence, the kind of weight that made a room rearrange itself around a person without them asking. He had dark hair cut short, and eyes that Lyra could not make out from this distance but that she already knew were gray. She had been told they were gray. Half the court whispered about his eyes in the same breath they whispered about his silence. He did not smile. He was not that kind of king. Around her, others moved through their own recognitions. A young man from the border towns let out a short, undignified sound and covered his mouth, staring across the room at a woman who stared back at him with the same stunned expression. An older lord gripped the arm of a woman beside him, and she turned to him slowly, and something passed between them that was private and enormous and entirely visible. Lyra watched these moments from the edges of her attention while her feet carried her forward, because the pull did not care that she was watching other people. The pull had no patience. She stopped 12 feet from the raised dais. The king's guard stood to either side of him, still as iron columns. His council sat arranged along the walls in order of rank. His high advisor, a silver-haired man named Corwin, watched the crowd with the careful attention of a man paid to watch crowds, and notice what others missed. He noticed Lyra. He glanced at the king. He glanced back at Lyra. His expression told nothing, which was how Lyra knew he had noticed everything. Kalen turned his gray eyes to her. The pull became a roar. She had read the old texts. Of course she had. She had always read everything she could get her hands on. It was the particular flaw of people who grew up underestimated. And the texts described the moment of recognition between fated mates in terms so extravagant she had discounted them on principle. Words like thunder and stars and the breaking of ancient locks. She had thought those were poetic licenses, embellishments, the kind of language people reach for when the truth is ordinary, and they want to make it magnificent. She understood now that the writers had been reaching for language that did not exist yet. It was not thunder. It was not stars. It was something more fundamental than both of those things. A moment of absolute clarity, like a fog lifting from a landscape she had been looking at her entire life, and suddenly every shape and color was sharp and real and hers to understand. He was hers. She knew it the way she knew her own name, not as a choice, not as a feeling she had cultivated, as fact, arriving in her bones and settling there with the weight of stone. Kalen Voss looked at her for a long moment. His face did not change. Around them, the hall had grown quieter as the night wore on, and more pairs completed their recognitions. The high advisor moved to the king's side and bent close, speaking in a low voice. The king did not look at him. He kept his eyes on Lyra. She held still under his gaze and did not flinch, because she had grown up in a household of men who believed they could intimidate a woman into smaller versions of herself, and she had never allowed it, and she was not going to start now in front of an audience of hundreds. He came down the steps of the dais. The crowd parted around him without being asked. That was the kind of man he was. Spaces made themselves available for him. People stepped back not out of fear but out of something older, the deep animal acknowledgement of a predator who had never needed to prove it. He stopped in front of her. This close, his eyes were the exact shade of gray she had been told. Storm cloud in winter, flat light on deep water. She kept her expression composed and met them directly. Because she was Lyra Ashwood of Ember Ridge, and she had not come to this hall to be unmade by a pair of eyes, however extraordinary. "You feel it," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment that stretched in all directions. She watched him, not searching his face for warmth, not hoping for a smile. She was watching the way a person watches a problem they need to understand before they can address it. She was cataloging him, the slight tension in his jaw, the controlled stillness of his hands, the way he breathed, slow and measured, like a man who had trained every instinct toward restraint. "I know who you are," he said. "I assumed," she said. A flicker of something moved behind his eyes, not quite surprise, closer to reassessment. "Lyra Ashwood," he said. "Ember Ridge, third daughter of Lord Aldous Ashwood." He paused. No official rank, no treaty alliances, no formal role in any court. She heard what he was doing. He was listing her deficiencies in the language of politics. She had known people who spoke this language her whole life, men who reduced other people to their utility, who looked at a person and calculated what they were worth in terms of what they could offer, or what they would cost. "That is accurate," she said. His jaw tightened by a fraction. "I need you to understand something. You should know," she said, and her voice was quiet and entirely steady, "that whatever you are about to say, I am going to remember it exactly as you said it for the rest of my life." He stopped. Something moved across his face. Fast, and then gone. She did not name it. "The bond is real," he said. "I feel it. I am not going to pretend otherwise." "Then what are you pretending?" she asked. His gray eyes held hers. "A king's marriage is not a private matter. A king's mate is not chosen by the moon, or by ancient forces, or by any system outside of political reality. My kingdom requires alliances that Ember Ridge cannot provide. My position requires a queen whose name carries weight in every court from here to the northern borders, whatever this is." He gestured between them, a minimal movement that somehow contained enormous precision. "It is not something I am able to act on." The hall was very quiet around them. Lyra understood, in the part of her mind that processed information rather than felt it, that this conversation was being witnessed by every significant figure in the known territories, that whatever happened next would be spoken about in courts and councils for generations, that the Blood Moon ceremony was the one event that carried enough gravity to make even kings accountable to an audience. She also understood that the scar on her wrist, the one that had not yet formed, the one that was burning already in the space where a mating mark should appear, was about to be made permanent by different means. "Then say it properly," she said. "If you are going to do it, do not half do it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke the ancient words. They were not long. The language of formal rejection was old enough to predate the kingdoms themselves, a set of phrases so spare they barely qualified as sentences. He spoke them in the old tongue, correctly and completely, and each word landed in the hall like a stone dropped into still water, sending its ripples outward in silence. The mark that had been forming on her wrist stopped, cooled, left behind a faint white scar, not the rich gold and silver of a completed mating bond, but the pale, healed-over look of something that had started and been stopped, like a sentence ended too early, like a door closed on a room that had been just beginning to warm. She did not move. Around them, the hall had gone completely still. Corwin, the High Advisor, was watching her with an expression she could not read, too carefully composed to be comfortable, too attentive to be merely polite. The young lord from the border towns who had found his mate an hour ago was staring at Lyra with his new mate's hand pressed to his chest, and the most naked expression of horror on his face. Several of the older lords had gone still in the particular way of people who understand they are witnessing something that will need to be discussed privately at length. Kalen Voss stepped back. It was the smallest motion in the world. "You will be compensated," he said. "Land, a title, whatever Ember Ridge requires to." "Do not," she said. He stopped. "Do not offer me land," she said. "Do not offer me a title. Do not reduce this to a transaction and then act as though you have done me a courtesy." She kept her voice very quiet. Quieter than she had intended, actually. She had prepared herself for this conversation to require volume, and she was finding instead that the quieter she spoke, the more space the words took up in the room. "You had a right to make this choice. I am not disputing the right. I am simply asking you not to insult me after it." Kalen looked at her. In that moment, she would know this later. She would be able to look back at that exact second and identify it precisely. She saw something in his face that was not policy, and not calculation, and not the careful control of a man who had trained himself into a king. It was something much smaller and much older than any of those things. Something that lived in a part of him he had apparently been ignoring for a long time. But it was there for only a moment. Then it was gone, and he was the king again, and she was a complication he had just resolved. "As you wish," he said. He turned. He walked back up the steps of the dais and resumed his position, and the court, because courts are extraordinary mechanisms for the management of awkwardness, began, slowly and carefully, to resume its noise. The musicians started playing again. A servant appeared with a tray of glasses. Someone across the room laughed at something, too loud, the laugh of a person nervous and grateful for an excuse to make sound. Lyra stood exactly where she was. She did not trust herself to move yet, not because she was about to weep. She was not. She could feel the absolute frozen solidity of herself with some precision. But because she had learned a long time ago that the most important thing she could offer herself in a difficult moment was the choice of when to move. Not to be moved, not to be carried away by the current of what had just happened. To choose deliberately when to take the next step. She looked at her wrist. The white scar was very small, a half-inch of pale skin, barely raised. You could miss it if you were not looking. She would not be missing it. Corwin appeared at the edge of her vision. He stopped a respectful distance away and said nothing, which told her he was not there to manage her on behalf of the king. He was simply standing near her, in the way that people sometimes stand near other people after something large has happened, offering proximity without agenda. She appreciated it more than she expected to. "How long have you known him?" she asked. 22 years, Corwin said. "And is he always like this?" A long pause. "He is always exactly as deliberate as tonight. The reasons vary." She looked at Corwin for the first time. He was older than she had thought from a distance. The silver of his hair was not the silver of middle age, but of something further along, and his face had the specific quality of a face that has spent decades watching powerful people make consequential decisions, and learning to keep its own counsel about most of them. "Was he wrong?" she asked. Corwin considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which she respected. "He was not wrong about his kingdom's needs," he said. "He may have been wrong about the cost of meeting them this way." He glanced at the king on the dais, who was now speaking with two lords and holding a goblet and looking, from a distance, utterly composed. "He is very good at calculating what things cost. He is sometimes less good at calculating which currency the price gets paid in." Lyra nodded slowly. She looked once more at Kalen Voss, this king who had looked at her and felt what she felt and chosen, with full awareness and complete deliberateness, to walk away from it. She took in the line of his shoulders, the controlled posture, the gray eyes now turned to his lords and giving nothing to the room she was standing in. She remembered every word he had spoken. She had told him she would, and she was not a person who made claims she did not intend to keep. Then she turned. She walked toward the great doors of the hall with her head level and her hands loose at her sides and the white scar on her wrist cool in the warm air of the candle-lit room. She did not look back, not because she was performing composure, she was too tired for performance, but because there was nothing behind her now that she needed to see. The guard at the door pulled it open without being asked. Outside, the blood moon hung heavy and red in the sky above Ashenfall, and the air was cold and clean, and Lyra Ashwood walked into it and kept walking, and the door closed behind her, and the hall swallowed her absence like it had swallowed 1,000 others before it. She did not stop until she reached the courtyard wall. She pressed her back against the stone, tilted her face up toward the moon, and breathed. Once, twice, 3 times. The moon did not answer. It never did. But it was very large and very red and very old, and there was a particular kind of comfort in looking at something that had been watching the world long enough to have seen this exact moment 1,000 times in 1,000 different shapes, and was still there, and was still shining, and had not decided that any of it was the end of anything. She looked at her wrist again. The scar was real. It was permanent. It would be there when she woke up tomorrow, and the day after, and every day for the rest of her life. She closed her fingers around it. Then she pushed off the wall, straightened her spine, and walked toward her chambers. Behind her, through the stone walls of the hall, she could hear the faint sounds of the ceremony continuing. Music, voices, the particular brightness of a crowd that had absorbed something enormous and was choosing, as crowds do, to keep celebrating regardless. A blood moon happened once a generation. You did not leave early because of someone else's drama. She had not planned to leave early either. But the night had rearranged itself without her permission, and now she was here, outside, alone, with a scar on her wrist and 300 witnesses to what had just happened inside, and the moon overhead turning the whole courtyard the color of old copper. She had spent 23 years being underestimated. She supposed one more thing had been added to the list tonight. She would deal with it in the morning. the same way she had always dealt with every other thing that had ever been handed to her without her consent, carefully, quietly, and completely on her own terms. The door to the residential wing was unlocked. She went through it, and up the stairs and into the corridor that smelled of beeswax and old wood, and finally into the room they had given her for the duration of the ceremony, which was a good room, well appointed, with a window that looked north toward the mountains she had grown up under. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at her hands for a long time. Then she got up, went to the writing desk by the window, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began, not to write, not yet, but to think, to organize, in the precise and methodical way that had always been her best defense against the world, exactly what had happened, what it meant, and what she was going to do next. Outside, the blood moon burned on. Inside, Lyra Ashwood did not cry. That was not the night for it. She was saving that for later, for somewhere private, for a moment when no one was watching and she could afford to be undone for exactly as long as it took, and then put herself back together with no audience and no performance and no one to see the seams. Tonight, she planned. Tomorrow, she would begin. The letter was the worst of it. Lyra found it at the back of the desk drawer, behind a small journal she no longer wrote in, and a folded map of the northern ridges she had carried for years like a good luck charm. She had forgotten about the letter entirely, or perhaps she had been choosing, in the particular way that the mind sometimes chooses, to forget certain things until the moment when not remembering them becomes impossible. She pulled it out by its corner. It was unsealed. She had never sent it. She had written it 11 months ago, late in winter, in the lowest part of a long bad season, when the cold had settled over Ember Ridge and refused to lift, and she had found herself sitting at her desk with a candle burning low, and the particular reckless honesty that comes over a person when it is 2 a.m, and they are very cold and very tired, and the things they have been suppressing start to find their way out through their hands. She had written to Kalen Voss. Not formally, not politically. She had written to him the way she might have written in a journal if she had trusted journals, which she did not. She had always believed that honesty written for the self tended to curl into performance anyway, becoming the version of honesty you wanted to have, rather than the kind that actually lived in you. So she had addressed it to him, to the specific person she had been thinking about in the abstract, particular way she had been thinking about him for longer than she liked to admit. She had written about the pull she felt, the one she had been aware of since she was old enough to understand what the stories meant, the one that pointed north toward Ashenfall like a compass needle that had no interest in geography. She had written about the fact that she had never spoken of it to anyone, not her father, not her sisters, not the pack elders who had watched her grow up and knew more about her internal life than she had ever consciously shared with them. She had written about the embarrassing, undignified, completely involuntary hope that had lived in her chest for years, quiet as a buried coal. She had written it honestly and clearly in her best handwriting, and then she had folded it and put it in the drawer and never sent it, because she had not been out of her mind. She held it now. The paper had gone slightly soft at the edges from months in the drawer, and the ink was a shade lighter than she remembered, as though even the letter itself had been trying to fade into something more manageable. She could feel the shape of the words through the fold without reading them, the weight of them, the particular density of honest language that cost something to write. She lit a match. She did not reread it first. She had written it, and she knew what was in it, and she did not need to read it again. And more importantly, she did not want to spend the rest of this night in the company of a past version of herself, who had been wrong about something in the most public way possible. The paper caught at the corner, and she held it over the small iron dish she used for sealing wax and watched it burn. It burned quickly, as paper does, faster than she expected, the words disappearing into bright orange and then charring into black, and then crumbling into gray, as she tilted the dish, and the ash fell away from her hand. Gone. She washed the ash off her fingers at the basin in the corner. Across the corridor she could hear her pack. 3 of them had made the journey from Ember Ridge with her. Owen Hale, who was the oldest of the 3 and who had known her since she was 9 years old, and had an unshakable, infuriating, deeply comforting habit of being exactly where he was needed. Clara Dove, her closest friend in every meaningful sense of the word, who was 25 and sharp-tongued and had a laugh that could reorganize a room, and Pip, formerly Philip Wren, barely 20, who had joined the Ember Ridge pack 2 years ago, and had attached himself to Lyra with the specific devotion of someone who had found, for the first time, a place where their particular qualities were not considered defects. They were pretending to sleep. She could hear them not sleeping, the careful stillness of 3 people holding very quiet, the occasional small movement that betrayed alertness rather than rest. She opened her door. "You can stop performing," she said. A pause. Then Owen's voice, from the room across the way. We weren't performing. You were breathing like people in a stage play, she said. Come in. They came in. Clara sat on the window bench immediately, drawing her knees up and looking at Lyra with the direct, unblinking attention of someone who has decided not to manage another person but to simply be present for them. Owen stood near the door with his arms folded, which was his thinking posture, and his concerned posture, and his every significant posture, because Owen communicated primarily through where he stood and how he folded his arms. Pip sat on the floor with his back against the bed, which was exactly what Pip always did, and which always made the space feel slightly more like the pack's common room at home, and slightly less like wherever they actually were. Tell us, Clara said. So Lyra told them. Not everything. She left out the parts that were most private, the physical sensation of the pull, the specific moment when she had seen something in Kaylin's eyes that was not policy, because those things belonged to her and she was not ready to let them out into the air yet. But she told them the shape of it, the words he had used, the ancient phrases of formal rejection, spoken correctly, which meant she had no recourse and he had no obligation, and the thing between them was officially and permanently and legally ended before it had ever properly begun. Owen was very still while she talked. Clara's expression shifted through several things: surprise, which gave way to anger, which gave way to something harder and quieter, and more lasting than anger, which Lyra recognized as her friend making a private decision about how she felt about Kaylin Voss that she would carry with her, and never entirely put down. Pip said nothing at all, but reached up and put his hand briefly on Lyra's ankle, a small and completely genuine gesture that said I am here, without requiring her to do anything about it. What do you need? Owen asked, when she was done. This was the thing about Owen. He did not offer. He did not suggest. He did not tell her what he thought she ought to feel or do or be. He had been asking her this specific question in this specific tone since she was 9 years old, and had come home with a split lip from a training accident and sat in the pack kitchen eating nothing, and he had sat across from her with his arms folded and asked, What do you need? It was the question that never assumed an answer. It was the question that gave her the most room. I need to leave, she said. Not tonight. In the morning, when it is light, and when leaving looks like a choice rather than a flight. Owen nodded. And before that, she said, I need someone to tell me something ordinary. A brief silence. Then Clara said, I lost my left boot at the ceremony, and I cannot find it anywhere. I have looked in every reasonable location, and 2 unreasonable ones. Lyra laughed. It was a small laugh, shorter than usual, with a rough edge that neither of them commented on. But it was real, and it moved through the room and shifted the temperature of it by a fraction, and afterward the room felt slightly less like the place where something large had happened, and slightly more like a room where 4 members of a pack were sitting together late at night talking about small things. Pip found Clara's boot under the bed. He had not been looking for it. He had simply reached under the bed to retrieve a fallen pillow and come back with both. Clara held it up. Extraordinary. I have a gift, Pip said. They stayed like that for another hour, not talking about the ceremony, not talking about the king or the scar or what came next, just occupying the same space and speaking about small things with the ease of people who had been in enough difficult situations together to know that sometimes being together was the whole of what was needed. When they finally slept, Lyra lay in the dark with her right hand covering her left wrist, and looked at the ceiling and thought. She thought with the specific, careful quality that had always characterized the best parts of her mind, not the part that felt things, which was considerable, and which she had been managing her entire adult life, but the part that organized them. She listed what she knew. She listed what she did not know. She identified the places where what she knew and what she did not know intersected in ways that were important. She thought about Ember Ridge, her home, the 300 souls of the pack who were her responsibility, in ways that had nothing to do with formal title, and everything to do with the fact that she was the one who showed up. She thought about what the morning would require of her. It would require first that she eat something, because she had not eaten since midday and her body had absorbed an enormous amount of the kind of event that costs people, and a cost had to be paid in something. It would require, second, that she speak to her father. Lord Aldous Ashwood would hear about tonight before morning. News of this kind moved through court circles the way water moved downhill, following the easiest path and arriving at the lowest point without anyone needing to carry it. She would need to reach him before he reached her, so that she could control the shape of the conversation rather than finding herself inside the shape he chose. It would require, third, that she make a decision about the border dispute. This was the ordinary thing she had come to Ashenfall to address. The water rights negotiation between Ember Ridge and the 3 packs of the Southern Flats who shared the lower river basin. It was an unglamorous piece of business, the kind of thing that senior lords sent their younger, less prestigious family members to handle. She had been sent because her father considered it beneath his personal attention, and had 3 more impressive daughters to put forward at events that required impressing. She had agreed to come because she was good at it, not because anyone had told her she was good at it. She had been given exactly no indication of that from any direction. But she had read everything ever written about the river basin. She had spoken with every farmer and fisherman along Ember Ridge's stretch of the water. She had spent 6 months assembling a picture of the dispute that was more complete and more accurate than anything in the official records. She had come prepared in a way that no one had asked her to be prepared, because that was how she operated, and the fact that no one had asked was irrelevant to whether it was useful. She was going to go to the border negotiations. She was going to resolve them, and then she was going to go home. Not because she was retreating, not because Ashenfall had broken something in her that needed to be repaired in familiar territory, but because home was where her work was, and work was the clearest and most honest thing she knew, and she had never been someone who let the landscape of her private life prevent her from doing what she was there to do. The ceiling of the room had a crack running across its northwest corner that looked, in the pre-dawn light beginning to soften through the curtains, very slightly like the river basin she had spent 6 months studying. She stared at it. She thought about the water. Where it moved, how it moved, what it cost the people along its banks when someone upstream took more than their portion, and what it cost them more when the argument about it ran on for years and left everyone depleted by the fighting, rather than enriched by the water they were fighting about. She thought about Kalen Voss standing at the far end of a great hall and feeling the pull and choosing the calculation over the pull. She thought about the fact that she had felt the same pull and had made no calculation at all, and she was not sure whether that said something flattering or unflattering about her. She decided it was neither. It was simply true. She had felt it, and she had walked toward it, because walking toward true things was the only kind of honesty she had ever fully trusted. The outcome had not been what the feeling promised. That did not make the feeling wrong. It made the outcome limited, which was a different matter entirely. By the time the light through the curtains had gone from gray to pale gold, she had made her plans. She rose. She dressed. She braided her hair without looking at it, from memory, the way she had done since she was old enough to do it herself. She looked at the desk where the letter had been. The iron dish held a small pile of ash. She carried it to the window and opened the casement and turned the dish into the cold morning air, and the ash scattered and was taken by the wind before it had gone more than a foot, and that was the end of the letter, and the end of the winter that had produced it, and the end of whatever version of herself had sat at 2 a.m. writing her honest private heart to a man who had just stood in front of 300 witnesses and decided she was not worth the complication. "Good morning," Clara said from the doorway behind her. "Good morning," Lyra said. "Owen has found us breakfast." "Of course he has." She closed the window. She turned from the ash. She walked toward the door, and the morning, and whatever came next. Downstairs, Owen had indeed found them breakfast. Not from the formal hall, which would have required them to walk past 100 people who had witnessed last night, and would be watching them with the specific sympathy that was hardest to absorb, but from the kitchens, where a cook named Bess had taken one look at Owen's face and the bundle he was carrying, and asked no questions, and provided bread and soft cheese and a jar of preserved plums, that she pressed on them, with the manner of a woman who understood that food was sometimes the most genuine thing a person had to offer. They ate in the courtyard. The blood moon was gone. The sky was clean and pale and extraordinarily ordinary, and the courtyard pigeons were conducting their usual morning business, and the air smelled of stone and bread and the distant sharp green of pine from the hills beyond the wall. Lyra ate all of her bread and most of the plums and none of the cheese, because she had never liked soft cheese, even in a crisis. "The negotiations," Owen said, when the eating was mostly done. "I know," she said. 2 days' ride south. "I know. We should leave before the court wakes up properly." She looked at him. "I am not leaving like I am running away." He looked back at her with the patience of 22 years. Leaving before the court wakes up is not running away. It is simply being efficient. It will look like running away. "The people who will decide what it looks like," Owen said, "have already decided everything they are going to decide. What you do today will not change the version of events they have already composed." He picked up the last piece of bread. "But it will affect what you do today, which is the only part of this that is actually yours." She was quiet for a moment. "Fine," she said. "Wonderful," said Clara. "I will get the horses." The sun was barely 2 hands above the hills when they rode out through the southern gate of Ashenfall. The gate guard was a young man, barely 17, who recognized Lyra and said nothing, which was a mercy she would remember later. He pulled the gate open and they rode through into the road, and behind them, Ashenfall receded into the morning like a stone into water, and the road ahead was long and uneven, and entirely hers to travel. She did not look back. She had already decided, the night before, that looking back was done. Not because she was not allowed to carry the weight of it. She was, and she did. She could feel it in her chest like the after-echo of the pull that was no longer there, a hollow resonance where something had been, and was now gone. But carrying a weight and turning toward it every few minutes to make sure it was still there were different activities, and only one of them was useful. The road to the border was long. The road to the border was hers. She rode into the morning and did not slow down. The southern flats smelled like river water and old argument. Lyra noticed this the moment they crossed into the lower basin territory. Not just the physical smell of the water, which was real and present and pleasantly cold in the morning air, but something less tangible. The atmospheric quality of a dispute that had been running long enough to become its own kind of weather. It sat over the landscape the way a storm sits over hills before it decides to break. Everyone who lived here had been breathing it for so long they had stopped noticing it. She noticed it. She always noticed the things that other people had stopped registering. The negotiations were being held at a way station called Three Bridges, which had earned its name from the 3 stone crossings that spanned the river at the point where it split briefly into 3 channels before rejoining downstream. It was a practical location, neutral ground, equidistant from the territories in dispute, with enough space in its meeting hall for the delegations and their staff and the various advisors and record keepers who attended these things and rarely contributed to them. They arrived on the second day of riding, in the late afternoon, when the light was going gold over the flat water, and the reeds along the bank were moving in the kind of slow, untroubled way that reeds move when they have no investment in the concerns of the people passing by. The way station was buzzing. Not with productivity, with the particular texture of gathered frustration, too many people in a space that had been designed for transience, speaking over each other in the way of groups that have been speaking at each other, rather than with each other for long enough to lose track of what they were originally trying to say. A man came out to meet them before they had finished tethering the horses. He was perhaps 40, with a sun-darkened face and the slightly frantic energy of someone who had been put in charge of something that was going worse than expected. "You are from Ember Ridge?" he said. "I am Lyra Ashwood," she said. He looked at her, then at Owen, then back at Lyra, with the expression she had seen on 100 faces in 100 rooms, the brief recalculation of a person adjusting to the fact that the person in front of them was not who they had expected. "Lord Aldous sent. Lord Aldous sent me," she said. "I am his daughter. I have been managing Ember Ridge's water accounts for 4 years, and I have read every document relevant to this dispute since records began. Is there a reason you would prefer someone else?" He closed his mouth. "Good," she said. "Tell me what the current state of the negotiations is." His name was Foster, not the lead negotiator for any of the parties, but the way station's master, who had been attempting to manage the logistics of 3 competing delegations for 6 days, and had the look of a man running on very little sleep and a great deal of nervous energy. He told her, as they walked toward the meeting hall, that the negotiations had stalled entirely. The delegation from Southwater Pack had walked out of the morning session 2 days ago over a disputed survey. The delegation from the Flat River Alliance had responded by filing a formal complaint about the survey methodology. The official arbitrator, a lord's second son named Garrett, who had been sent from the Central Court with impressive credentials and no apparent ability to get 3 groups of people to agree on the direction of water flow, had spent most of yesterday writing letters to his superiors. "Where is Garrett now?" she asked. "In his room," Foster said, writing another letter. She paused outside the meeting hall door. "I will need the original survey documents," she said, "the ones from before the dispute began, the boundary records, the seasonal water tables, everything from the last 30 years if you have it. I will also need a private room to work in tonight and the assurance that no one interrupts me until morning." Foster stared at her. "The arbitrator." "I am not the arbitrator," she said. "I am representing one of the parties. But I have read enough about this dispute to know that both the Southwater complaint and the Flat River counter-complaint are based on the same fundamental misreading of the 1891 Basin Survey, and if someone explains that clearly to all 3 parties before they spend another week arguing about it, we can finish this in 2 days instead of 2 more months." A longer stare. "Do you have the documents?" she asked. "Yes," he said slowly. "They are in the records room. I will start there." The records room was small and dusty and smelled powerfully of old paper and damp stone. Lyra lit every available lamp, arranged the documents in chronological order on the work table, and began. Clara brought her supper at some point, which she ate without looking away from the survey maps. Owen appeared at the door twice, once to say goodnight, and once, later, to put a fresh lamp on the table without being asked. Pip fell asleep on the bench in the corner at some point after midnight, and she let him stay, because the sound of his breathing was company without being interruption. The 1891 survey was exactly as she had suspected, not falsified. That would have been easier to address, simply incomplete. The surveyor had taken his measurements during a drought year, when the river's summer flow was significantly below its average. Every party in the current dispute had been using those measurements as the baseline for their water rights, which meant every party had been working with a figure that was lower than what the river actually produced in a normal year. They were fighting over a scarcity that did not, in most years, exist. She checked the figure 3 times. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling, and felt the particular satisfaction of finding a clean answer in a complicated place. It was a feeling she trusted more than most. She found it again. The same quiet clarity she had felt in the moments before the blood moon ceremony had come apart. The same sense of something resolving itself from chaos into order. She had always had this, the ability to look at a tangle and find the single thread that, if pulled correctly, would loosen everything else. It had served her well in the management of Ember Ridge's affairs. It had served her less well in her personal life, because personal tangles often had no single thread, or if they did, it was one you were not supposed to pull. She pulled the water rights thread. In the morning, she requested a joint session of all 3 delegations. Garrett, the official arbitrator, appeared at the meeting hall with the nervous dignity of a man who had been told by the waystation master that one of the party representatives wished to present new findings, and who was uncertain whether this was good news or a complication. He was perhaps 28, with a careful beard, and the kind of formal posture that came from training rather than confidence. He sat at the head of the table, and gave Lyra a look that was not quite welcome, and not quite challenge. A look that was waiting to see what she did before committing to an opinion. She laid the survey documents on the table. She did not make a speech. She had learned a long time ago that speeches told people what they were supposed to conclude, and people resisted being told. What she did instead was walk through the documents in the order she had organized them, pointing to the specific figures and dates that mattered, and asking questions that guided the delegations to the conclusion themselves. The Southwater lead, a middle-aged woman named Holt with a direct gaze, and the working hands of someone who had grown up along the river rather than simply managing it, was the first to see it. The 1891 baseline, Holt said. Drought year, Lyra confirmed. Holt looked at the documents, then at the women on either side of her, then back at the documents. We have all been calculating from a drought year. For 30 years, Lyra said. A silence that moved through the room in a specific direction, the direction of people realizing that they had been right about what they were owed and wrong about the amount of it, which was a strange and disorienting position to find oneself in. More comfortable than being simply wrong, but more complicated than being simply right. The Flat River Alliance's lead looked at his own notes, then at Holt, then at Lyra. If the baseline is recalculated using an average year measurement, there is enough water, Lyra said. Not comfortably, not wastefully, but enough. If the allocation is adjusted to reflect the actual average rather than the drought year. She put her hand on the document that showed the 3 territories' current usage against the corrected figure. You have been arguing about how to divide a shortage that does not exist in most years. What you need to negotiate now is how to handle the years when the shortage is real. Garrett leaned forward, that is. He stopped. Looked at the documents. Looked at Lyra. That is actually the correct framing. I know, she said, and kept her voice entirely pleasant when she said it. The session went on for 6 more hours. It was not easy, it never was, because even when the core problem was resolved, the accumulated injuries of a long dispute had to be addressed, the things people had said to each other in the heat of months-long argument, the smaller grievances that had attached themselves to the larger one like barnacles, and would not come off simply because the ship had changed course. But the shape of it had changed, the impossibility had become merely difficult, and difficult was something these delegations could work with. By late afternoon, they had a framework, not an agreement, that would require another day and formal documentation, and the signatures of people with more official authority than Lyra possessed. But a framework, the bones of something that could hold water. Holt found her in the corridor outside the hall afterward. You are Aldous Ashwood's daughter, Holt said. It was not entirely a question. 3rd daughter, Lyra said. Holt looked at her with the assessment of a woman who had spent a lifetime reading people who were trying to get things from her. He has 3 daughters? 4, actually. And he sent you to this. Holt's tone was flat in a way that could have meant several things. He sent me because he did not consider it important, Lyra said. He was wrong about that, but it worked out for the river basin, so. Holt almost smiled. How old are you? 23. Holt was quiet for a moment. Where are you going after this? Home, Lyra said. Ember Ridge. Useful place to be, Holt said, in a tone that suggested she meant something larger than the geographical. There is a council meeting in the summer, all the basin territories, to ratify whatever comes out of this. I am going to request that Ember Ridge send a representative. She looked at Lyra directly. I am going to be specific about which representative. Lyra met her eyes. That is kind of you. It is not kindness, Holt said. I cannot afford kindness in my position. It is accurate allocation of useful things. She extended her hand. But it is also not nothing. Lyra shook it. She stood in the corridor after Holt had gone and felt, for the first time since the blood moon ceremony, something that was not pain and not numbness, and not the careful control she had been holding herself under since she walked out of the great hall of Ashenfall into the cold night air. It was something closer to recognition. Not the pull, nothing like the pull, not that bone-deep pointing, not that roar of absolute clarity. This was quieter. It was the recognition of someone who had just been seen accurately by another person who had no reason to flatter her. It was the particular quality of being measured by someone who measured things for a living, and having the measurement come back as something real. She had always known she was capable. She had simply been in rooms, for most of her life, where the people doing the measuring were looking for something else. Owen appeared at the end of the corridor. Done? He said. Framework, she said. Tomorrow for the formal draft. He nodded. There is food. Good, she said. I want the preserved plums again if Bess packed more. She did not. We are in the southern basin. They have different plums here. What kind? Green ones. Pip described them as complex. That is a terrible sign, she said. He also said they were good. That is a better sign. She walked down the corridor toward the smell of food and the sound of her pack, and the ordinary fact of the evening, which was cold and clear and had nothing in it, for the first time in days, that required her to be braced against. She let herself unclench, just slightly. It was not the whole of the tension, that would take longer, but a fraction of it released, like the first small portion of a knot that gives way and tells you the whole knot is, eventually, possible. The river ran on outside. Lyra Ashwood sat down to dinner with her pack and ate the complex green plums, which were actually very good, and talked about nothing important for the rest of the evening, and did not once, in all of it, allow herself to think about gray eyes. She almost managed it. He arrived on the 3rd morning like weather that had not been in the forecast. No announcement, no advance letter, no delegation of outriders preceding him to establish his rank and prepare the room and ensure that whatever space he was about to occupy had been made ready for the weight of him. He simply arrived, riding at the head of a group of 6, and the group was quiet and fast and carried itself with the particular efficiency of people who had learned not to announce themselves in advance because announcements created expectations, and expectations created complications. Lyra was in the records room when she heard the horses. She looked up from the revised survey framework she had been annotating and listened. There was something different about the quality of the noise from the courtyard below, a shift in the way the waystation staff moved and spoke, the specific register of heightened attention that a place takes on when something significant arrives. She was very good at reading the atmospheric pressure of rooms and buildings. She had learned it young, out of necessity. She went to the window. The man at the head of the riders was tall in the saddle, in the way that some people are tall regardless of whether they are standing or sitting. It was not the height that registered first, but the quality of how he occupied his space, the absence of any wasted movement, the stillness of a person who had learned not to perform his own importance because he had never needed to. He dismounted without anyone coming to help him, which told her something. His riders stayed on their horses, which told her more. He looked at the waystation with the assessing gaze of someone who had been reading buildings his whole life, and then he looked toward the window where she was standing. She did not step back. He looked at her for a moment. Then he went inside. She heard his voice in the corridor below, low, even, asking for the session lead. She heard Foster's voice responding with the particular flutter of a man who has suddenly realized who is standing in his waystation. She heard a door open and close, and then the careful silence of a building that has registered that something has changed about the situation inside it. Garrett knocked on her records room door approximately 8 minutes later. There has been an... Garrett visibly reorganized himself. King Darin Malkiel of Ironvale is here. Lyra set down her annotation pen. Ironvale shared a border with 3 of the 7 territories whose water rights intersected with the Southern Basin. It was not officially a party to this negotiation. It was, however, the kind of presence that made every negotiation in its vicinity immediately more complicated, because Ironvale was old and large and had a history of being involved in regional water agreements at the point where involvement became a form of resolution by sheer gravity. "What is he here for?" she asked. Garrett looked uncertain. "He says," another small reorganization, "he says he has a new survey methodology to offer that may resolve the seasonal flow question." A pause. "He also says he heard there was interesting work being done here." A new survey methodology was plausible. The seasonal flow question was real and had not been fully resolved in yesterday's session. These were legitimate reasons to be here. The second reason was something else. "Tell him the joint session resumes in an hour," Lyra said, "and ask Foster to set another place at the table." She went back to her annotations. She was aware, in the part of her mind that ran in the background of everything else she did, that she was not as calm as the annotations suggested. Not because of Ironvale, the politics of Ironvale she could manage, but because the arrival of a king, any king, in any room that she was currently in, had acquired a particular quality since the Blood Moon ceremony that it had not had before. She breathed it away. She finished the annotations. When she walked into the meeting hall an hour later, he was already there. King Darin Malkiel of Ironvale was standing at the far end of the table, looking at the original survey documents she had spread out yesterday, and he was reading them. Not performing the reading of them. Not looking at them to be seen looking. He was reading them in the focused, absorbed way of a person who is genuinely interested in what they say. He looked up when she came in. His eyes were dark, brown so deep it read as almost black in the morning light from the hall's high windows. He was older than Kaelin by perhaps 8 or 10 years, which put him somewhere in his mid-30s, and his face had the quality of a landscape rather than a portrait, not designed to be looked at from a single angle, but shaped by accumulation, by weather and decision and time. His hair was dark and slightly longer than court convention, and he had not shaved this morning, which suggested either that he did not care about the impression, or that he had been writing hard and prioritized arriving over preparing. She suspected both. "The 1891 baseline," he said, without preamble. "Yes," she said. "Drought year." "Yes." He looked at the document, then at her. "Who found it?" "I did," she said. "2 nights ago." He looked at her for a moment with that assessing quality. Not unkind, not condescending, simply very direct. The gaze of a person who had learned to look at things the way they actually were, rather than the way he had been told they were. "I have been trying to resolve a related dispute on Ironvale's eastern boundary for 4 months," he said. "Our official team has been using the same 1891 data." He put his finger on the specific figure she had circled in the document. "If this calculation is correct." "It is correct," she said. His gaze shifted back to her. "I know what I wrote," she said. "I have checked it 3 times. It is correct." A pause. Then, for the first time, something changed in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the near relative of one, the small movement of a face that is considering amusement while not committing to it. "All right," he said. The session began. He sat at the table to Lyra's left, slightly back from his official position at the head, and he was a strange and useful presence, not speaking often, but when he did, his contributions were precise and load-bearing in the way that changed the direction of a conversation, rather than simply adding to it. He was not there to perform authority, he was there to work. She found herself recalibrating to him without meaning to. Not in the way she had recalibrated in the Great Hall of Ashenfall. That had been biological, involuntary, as automatic as breathing. This was different. This was the specific, deliberate kind of attention that a person pays to something that turns out to be more interesting than they expected it to be. He caught her looking once. She did not look away, neither did he. The session ran for 4 hours. By the end of it, the framework had become a draft, and the draft had a section it had not had before. A methodological addendum for seasonal flow calculation that incorporated Ironvale's northern basin data and produced a significantly more robust picture of how the river actually behaved across different years and different weather patterns. It was better. Genuinely, materially better than what they had been working with. Garrett shook Darin's hand at the end of the session with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had arrived expecting his most difficult day, and was leaving having had his most productive one, Holt lingered, speaking to one of the Flat River leads. Lyra gathered her documents. "You are from Ember Ridge," Doran said. He was still at the table, watching her sort the papers. "Yes." "I did not receive a briefing that indicated Lord Aldous was sending anyone significant to this." She looked up from the documents. Lord Aldous did not consider it significant enough to warrant someone significant. That was a mistake on his part. She held his gaze. "Yes, but it produced useful results for everyone else, so." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Stay for the second session tomorrow. There is a flow model I brought from Ironvale that your framing of the dispute would significantly improve." She should say no. She had the framework, she had the draft, she could leave tomorrow morning with exactly what Ember Ridge needed and be home in 3 days. But the flow model was real. She had heard him reference it during the session, and the data it contained was data she had been trying to find for 2 years. "I will need to see the model before I can agree to staying," she said. He pulled a document from his own stack and slid it across the table. She looked at it. The model was very good. She looked at him. "Tomorrow's session," she said. "Tomorrow's session," he confirmed. She picked up her documents, tucked the flow model on top, and walked toward the door. "Miss Ashwood," he said, when she was almost through it. She stopped. "You found the error that 4 official delegations and 1 court arbitrator missed in 6 days," he said. "In 1 night." She waited. "I am noting it," he said, "in case it is useful to you to have it noted." She thought about all the rooms she had walked into in her life where no one had noted it. "Thank you," she said. She walked back to the records room. She sat down at the table and held the flow model document and let herself, in private, feel what it felt like to have her work seen accurately by someone with enough standing that the accuracy was not simply courtesy. It felt, she decided, like a window being opened in a room she had not noticed was stuffy. She put the feeling aside, the way she always put useful but inconvenient things aside, and began to read. The model was, on closer examination, even better than she had thought. She was still reading 2 hours later when Owen knocked to say that dinner was ready, and that Pip had found something interesting in the river, and would she please come look at it before it swam away. She went. The something interesting was a very large silver fish that had wedged itself between 2 of the bridge stones and appeared to be conducting some form of private protest about the structural situation. They all stood on the bridge and watched it for 10 minutes, until it resolved its disagreement with the stonework and swam away downstream, with the vigorous dignity of something that had made a point. "Metaphor," Clara said. "Please do not," Lara said. "I am just observing." "I know what you are observing." The evening was cold and clear, and the river ran black below the bridge, and the lights of the way station reflected in it in a long, wobbly stripe. Somewhere upstream, in the territories that had been arguing for 30 years, the farmers and fishermen were probably eating dinner too, not knowing yet that the argument was nearly over. Not knowing yet that in 2 days they would have a signed framework and a recalculated baseline, and the possibility of treating the water as the resource it actually was, rather than the scarcity they had been told it was. She wondered if they would feel it before they were told. She wondered if you could feel, somewhere in the body, the shift from conflict to resolution, not in yourself but in the territory you belonged to, whether the land knew, before the people did. She decided probably not. But she liked the thought. The silver fish had gone around the bend of the river and was long out of sight, heading south toward water that had no argument in it. She watched the place where it had been for a little while. Then she went back inside, and back to the flow model, and worked until the candles burned low. The message arrived at Ashenfall on the 14th of the month, and it sat on the council table while Corwin debated whether to deliver it before or after supper. He chose before. It was not kindness. Kindness was not a factor in how Corwin made decisions of this kind. It was strategic. A king who received difficult information before supper had time to process it. A king who received it after ate the information along with everything else and let it settle into him badly, and was difficult for 3 days after. Kalen read the message once. He set it down. He picked it up and read it again. The message was from Corwin's contact in the Southern Network, a perfectly ordinary person who worked as a record keeper in the waystation system and noted, in his weekly correspondence, whatever came through that seemed significant. He noted it without editorial comment, which was why Corwin paid him and why his reports were useful. The editorials came from Corwin himself, in his own considered assessment, which appeared in a separate document that he attached to the relevant messages when they crossed into territory worth discussing. This one had no editorial. It did not need one. The message described, in the compact and specific language of a man who understood that words cost money when you paid by the letter, what had happened in the joint session at Three Bridges Way Station. It described the correction of the 1891 baseline survey. It described the resolution of the 30-year Southern Basin dispute. It described the appearance of King Doran Malkiel of Ironvale and his subsequent contribution to the session. And it described the person whose work had made the resolution possible. Kaelin read the name. He set the message down for the second time. Across the council table, his four lords were watching him with the careful, lateral attention of men who had learned to read his moods from peripheral vision, because looking directly at him when he was processing something was the political equivalent of standing in the path of a river that had not yet decided how fast to move. "Leave me," he said. They left. Corwin stayed because Corwin always stayed, and because they had been doing this for 22 years and the only time Kaelin had ever told Corwin directly to leave the room, Corwin had gone to the door and waited just outside it for 11 minutes before Kaelin called him back in, which had established a sort of precedent. "Tell me about the dispute," Kaelin said. 30-year water rights conflict, Corwin said. Southern Basin, 3 territorial pacts plus several independent settlements along the lower river. The official arbitration had been stalled for 6 days, and she resolved it in a night. She resolved the underlying error in a night. The formal session that built on that resolution ran the following day. Kaelin was looking at the far wall. This was another of his habits. Not a blank look, but the specific focused distance of a man thinking about something he was not yet prepared to discuss out loud. Corwin recognized it and waited. "Who sent her?" Kaelin asked. "Lord Aldous." "Why?" "Because he did not consider the matter important enough to warrant anyone he considered important." Kaelin's jaw moved slightly. "He sent his third daughter to handle a dispute that had been deadlocked for 6 days, and she resolved it in one night. And his opinion of her value is low," Corwin said. "That is," Kaelin stopped. Corwin waited. "That is a significant misjudgment," Kaelin said. "Yes," Corwin said. He paused. "There is also the matter of Ironvale." Kaelin looked at him. King Doran's presence at the session was not in the official record, until the contact noted it, Corwin said. He arrived without announcement. His contribution to the session was, he chose the word carefully, notable. Define notable. He brought data that the official parties did not have, and that materially improved the resolution framework. He also, another careful pause, requested Miss Ashwood's presence for a second session the following day, to assist with a separate Ironvale matter using the same methodology. Kaelin was very still. This was distinct from his thinking about something stillness. Corwin had been cataloging the varieties of Kaelin's stillness for 2 decades, and this one was newer. He had first seen it 2 weeks ago, the night of the blood moon ceremony, when Lyra Ashwood had walked out through the great hall doors. He had not named it at the time. He was beginning to develop a provisional name for it now, but he was not going to share that with the king. "She stayed," Kaelin said. "She stayed," Corwin confirmed. Silence. The fire in the council room's hearth was doing the ordinary work of fires, producing light and warmth without commentary, which was more than could be said for the room's other occupant. "She is good," Kaelin said. "She is very good," Corwin said. "By the account, she is exceptional. The official arbitrator, Lord Brand's second son, you know him, wrote to his father that he has not seen that quality of analytical work in a formal session in his 4 years as a court arbiter. He is going to recommend her for a seat on the Basin Council." Kaelin picked up the message again. He read the name once more. Lyra Ashwood, of Ember Ridge. 3rd daughter. No official rank. No treaty alliances. No formal role in any court. All the things he had listed, standing in the great hall of Ashenfall, with the pull between them a physical fact, and his mind running through its calculations with the efficient coldness it always ran calculations with. He had been correct about the list. He had apparently been incorrect about what the list meant. Doran requested her for a second session, he said. "Yes. For a water rights matter." "Ostensibly," Corwin said, and left the word alone. Talon looked at him. Corwin was very experienced at meeting the king's gaze without flinching, and also without volunteering more than he had been asked for, which was the skill that had kept him in this position for 22 years. "He is unmarried," Kaelin said. "He is," Corwin said. "Has been since his first queen passed 4 years ago. The political situation in Ironvale requires a second bond. He has been looking." A pause. Carefully. Kaelin stood. He went to the window. Ashenfall at evening was a particular and impressive thing. The city spread below the palace walls like a map of itself. lit street by street as the lamps came on, the river that ran through its center catching the last of the light in a long silver line. It was his city. He had been born in this palace, and he had taken the throne at 19, and he had been doing the work of governing it for 9 years, with a focus and a commitment that had never wavered, and had cost him, in various ways that he had decided were acceptable costs, a number of things. He had not, until this moment, been entirely certain he had calculated the costs correctly. Not because he regretted the calculation. He was too honest with himself to pretend regret he did not feel, and what he felt right now was not regret in the simple sense. It was something more precise, the specific discomfort of a person who has made an accurate assessment and then discovered that accuracy and correctness are not always the same thing. He had been accurate about Lyra Ashwood's formal position. He had been accurate about the requirements of his kingdom. He had not been incorrect about any individual fact. But facts were not the whole of a picture. He understood this about most things. He had learned it from his father, who had been a man of incomplete pictures and had governed accordingly, and whose incomplete pictures had left Ashenfall with 2 unresolved border conflicts and a treasury that had required 4 years of his son's attention to stabilize. Kaelan had built his entire governing philosophy around the discipline of looking at the whole picture, not the convenient portion. He had looked at a partial picture on the night of the blood moon. The realization arrived without drama. That was how his most important realizations usually arrived, not as lightning, not as revelation, but as something quiet and irrefutable, the way a calculation completes itself, and the answer is simply there. He had looked at Lyra Ashwood, and listed the things she was not. He had not looked at what she was. He had not looked at the person who, 2 weeks after having something large and painful done to her in public, had ridden south to handle a diplomatic task that no one important wanted to handle, had read the relevant literature in a single night, had found the error in a document that a dozen trained officials had used without questioning for 30 years, and had used that error to resolve a conflict that was costing the Southern Basin a significant fraction of its productivity. He had not looked at that person. He had looked at her formal rank. He turned from the window. "Send me everything we have on the Iron Veil succession," he said. Corwin nodded, with the specific quality of a man filing a piece of information in the part of his mind that holds things he will think about later. "And the Southern Basin Council?" he asked. "They have requested official acknowledgement from the court regarding the framework." "Send it," Kaelan said, "and include a personal commendation for the Ember Ridge representative." Corwin wrote it down without looking up. "Should I use her name?" A pause. "Yes," Kaelan said. "Use her name." He went back to his chair. He picked up the day's other correspondence, the ordinary business of a kingdom that did not stop because its king was in the middle of a private recalculation, and he worked through it with his characteristic focus. And he signed what needed to be signed, and deferred what could be deferred, and dispatched what needed dispatching. But his supper, when it came, went largely untouched. He was not hungry. He was sitting with the particular sensation of a man who has just moved a piece on a board and cannot take it back, and has become aware, too late to be useful and too early to be resolved, that the game was not the game he thought he was playing. Corwin, when he came to clear the papers, looked at the untouched food and said nothing. But he noted it. The fire burned on. Outside, Ashenfall went about its evening, its streets lit and its people going home, and its river moving through its center in the same direction it had always moved, south toward the basin, toward the water that was going to be shared now. Finally, after 30 years of argument, because someone had looked at an old document and asked a very good question. Kaelan sat. He did not send another message to Corwin. He did not do anything sudden. He was a deliberate man, and the quality of his deliberateness had never yet failed his kingdom even when it had cost him other things, and he trusted it now because it was the only tool he fully trusted. But the untouched supper sat on the table beside him, and the name on the message sat in his mind, and the two facts between them arranged themselves into a pattern that he recognized from mathematics, and from governance, and from every other discipline that involved the honest accounting of what had been spent and what had been lost. He would need to think about this carefully. He was going to think about it very carefully indeed. Iron Veil in autumn was a place that looked like it had been built by people who took winter personally. The walls were thick, not defensively thick but practically thick, the thickness of stone that knows what cold can do and has decided to argue with it on a structural level. The buildings were low and strong and fitted into the landscape rather than imposed upon it, which gave the whole territory a quality of presence rather than display. It did not announce itself. It simply was, and had been, and would continue to be. Lyra noticed this on the road in, and thought it was the most honest architecture she had ever seen. She had not planned to be here for a third day after the negotiations concluded. She had planned to sign the framework, take her copy, and ride north to Ember Ridge with her pack and her flow model, and the specific satisfaction of work that had been done properly. She had a list, always, of the things waiting for her at home: the quarterly water accounts, the patrol schedule that needed revision, the young pack member who had come to her 3 weeks ago with a concern about the eastern boundary markers that she had not yet fully investigated. She had these things, and they were real, and they were hers, and they had been waiting patiently. She was still in the South. The reason she was still in the South was sitting across a large table covered in maps and telling her, with the direct and entirely unself-conscious competence of a person who was used to being good at things, exactly what the Eastern Iron Veil flow model had shown over the past 12 years, and where the discrepancy with the official projections was, and why it mattered. Doran did not explain things to her. He showed them to her, which was different. The distinction between a person who tells you the answer and a person who puts the evidence in front of you and trusts you to reach it. She had met almost no one in her life who did the second thing, and she had spent most of her professional existence in rooms full of people doing the first thing, often badly. "Here," he said, and put his finger on the graph at the point she had already identified. "The summer low is 2 months earlier than the model projects," she said. "Consistently. For the last 8 years. She looked at the data. "Your upstream diversion changed 8 years ago." He looked at her. "Yes. But the model was not updated." "The model was not updated," he confirmed, with the tone of a person who has been attempting to make this exact point to a room of people who were attached to the model for various reasons, that had nothing to do with whether it was accurate. "What changed upstream? New settlement, 2,000 people, a mill, agricultural irrigation." He pulled another document out and slid it across. The official assessment said it would not significantly affect downstream flow. She read the assessment. It was 3 years old, and the author had made a specific set of assumptions that were understandable given the information available at the time, and which were no longer valid given what had happened since. She noted where the assumptions diverged from what the 8-year data showed. "Your official assessment is wrong," she said. "I know. The people who wrote it are aware that I know," he said. "They are less aware of what to do about it, because correcting it officially means acknowledging that the original planning permission for the upstream settlement should have required a comprehensive flow impact study, and that study was not done, and several people who are still in positions of authority made that decision." She looked at him. "You want an independent analysis. I want an accurate one," he said. "The independence is a side effect of needing it to come from someone who did not participate in any of the original decisions." He looked at her directly. "You are a person who reads primary data and asks the questions that the people closest to it stopped asking because they got used to the assumptions." He looked at her. "You found the 1891 error that 4 official delegations missed. I am not asking you to redesign the Iron Veil water system. I am asking you to look at this data and tell me if what I think I am seeing is what is actually there." It was a reasonable request. It was more than reasonable. It was, she realized, the same kind of request that she would have wanted someone to make of her if she were in his position. The request that acknowledged her capability without overstating it, that gave her a task with defined edges and genuine stakes, that trusted her to operate within those edges, and say clearly if she thought the task exceeded them. She had not had many of those requests. "Give me the full 12-year data set," she said, "and the upstream settlement's agricultural records if you have them." "I have them," he said. She spent 2 days on it. Clara did not complain, but she did develop a specific look during this period, an expression that managed to communicate both genuine supportiveness and the personal opinion that Lyra Ashwood had been in this particular territory for an unusual number of days for a person who had come intending to spend one. Clara communicated a great deal through expression. It was an efficiency Lyra had always respected, even when she chose to ignore what was being communicated. She was choosing to ignore it. The data was extraordinary, not in what it showed. The correction was actually straightforward, once you had the right variables, but in the texture of 12 years of careful, consistent record-keeping. Someone in Iron Veil's water office had been measuring the flow at 12 points along the eastern tributary for a decade, with a regularity and precision that went significantly beyond what was officially required. She had been doing this work for years, and she had never seen data this clean. She asked Doran about it on the second evening. They were eating. Not formally, but in the smaller room adjacent to the main meeting hall that had, she had learned over the 2 days, a different character than the official spaces, less performing, more working. Doran seemed to prefer it. The record keeper, he said. A woman named Aldous. She has been at the Eastern Station for 18 years, and she decided, without being asked to and without additional funding, to expand the measurement points because she thought the official measurements were insufficient. He picked up his cup. She was right. She has always been right. We have never formally acknowledged this. Lyra looked at him. Why not? Because formally acknowledging it would require formally explaining why her judgment was better than the official assessment, which would require officially addressing the fact that several people who are still in positions of authority did not do their jobs as well as a woman in an unmapped station with insufficient resources. He set down the cup. I am in the process of changing this. It is slower than it should be. She thought about this. She thought about all the people like Aldous she had known, in every territory, in every field, the people who did meticulous, excellent, important work in places nobody looked, not because they were going to be recognized for it, but because it needed doing. And they were there, and they were the kind of person who did what needed doing regardless. She had been one of them. She was one of them. Is she going to be acknowledged? Lyra asked. In the formal adoption of the corrected model, yes. Her name will be on the documentation as the primary source of the data. He looked at her with a directness she had become, over 2 days, slightly accustomed to and simultaneously not at all accustomed to. I am also reorganizing the water monitoring office to make her the lead. She knows more than the person currently in the role. Lyra nodded slowly. You do this often? She asked. Correct misjudgments? When I find them. Acknowledge people who should have been acknowledged earlier? He was quiet for a moment. I try to. I am not always successful. Institutions have considerable inertia, and the people who benefit from the current arrangement of things do not yield without argument. He picked up his cup again. But I find that the argument is usually worth having. She looked at him across the table. She had been looking at him, she realized, with increasing frequency over the past 2 days, and each time she looked, she was looking at something slightly different than the last time. Not because he was changing, but because she was registering more detail each time. The way you register more detail about a landscape the longer you sit in it. She was noticing the way he moved in a space, always with purpose, never with performance. She was noticing the way he talked to his staff. The same directness he brought to conversations with her, applied equally regardless of rank. She was noticing the way he listened, which was one of the rarest things she knew how to notice in a person, because most people listened in order to speak, and he listened in order to understand. She was also noticing, and this she was filing in the part of her mind where she put things that were real but not yet ready to be examined, that when they were in the same room, something was changing in the way she experienced the space. Not dramatically, not with the force of the pull she had felt on the night of the blood moon. Quieter than that. The kind of change you notice only in retrospect, when you realize that a room has become more interesting than it was before a specific person walked into it. She was not going to examine this tonight. She was going to finish the flow model analysis and write her findings and give them to Doran and go home. I should finish the documentation tonight, she said. He nodded. I had Foster prepare a room for you. Better lamp than the last one. I noticed you were writing late. You noticed that? The light was on past midnight. She looked at him. I work late too, he said simply. She went back to the records room. She sat down at the table with the clean lamp and the 12 years of careful data, and she did the work, and she was good at it, and the work was good because of how good the data was. And somewhere in Iron Vale's eastern territory, a record keeper named Aldous was about to have her name on an official document that should have borne her name years ago. Lyra finished the analysis at 2 in the morning. She looked at it for a long time. Then she did something she had not done in a long time. She turned the document over and took a blank sheet from the stack and wrote a letter to her father. Not a report. Lord Aldous received reports from her regularly, the kind of business-like accounting of activity and outcomes that satisfied his requirement to feel informed without requiring him to be particularly interested. This was different. This was a letter of the kind she had not written to him in years, partly because he rarely responded to them and partly because she had stopped, somewhere in her mid-teens, producing things for people who did not receive them. But tonight she wrote it. She wrote about the basin dispute and the 1891 survey and what she had found. She wrote about the Iron Vale flow model and the correction, and the woman named Aldous whose data had made it possible. She wrote about what it felt like to be in a room where the work was taken seriously, and the person doing it was taken seriously, and the two things were not separated. She did not write about Doran. She wrote around him the way you write around a window in a room, noting the light that comes through it without describing the window itself, because the window was not the point, but the light was. She sealed it. She set it with the Morning Post. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the particular silence of Ironvale, which was different from the silence of Ember Ridge, colder and larger, more open at the edges, the silence of a territory that had a lot of space in it and was not embarrassed by that. She was not going to think about the light. She was not going to think about the way he had said, "I noticed you were writing late," with the absolute absence of calculation, no performance, just a man who had noticed something real and said so. She was not going to think about any of it. She was going home in the morning. She was almost certain she was going home in the morning. She closed her eyes. Outside, Ironvale was cold and dark and enormous, and somewhere in it the eastern tributary was running at exactly the flow rate she had calculated, measured by a woman who had been doing excellent work in an unmapped station for 18 years, and was about to have her name on something permanent. Lyra thought about that. It was a good thought. She kept it until she fell asleep. The summons arrived on a Tuesday. It came sealed with the Ashenfall royal mark, a deep impression in black wax, the crown and mountain seal that every lord in every territory recognized on sight. It was the kind of seal that made people straighten without meaning to, that produced a reflexive attention in the room when it appeared, a physical response to the accumulated weight of what it represented. The rider who brought it had ridden through the night. Lyra was at breakfast in the small room adjacent to the main hall when Foster brought it to her. He set it beside her cup with the manner of a man delivering something he was uncertain about, which was the most information she needed to know before she picked it up. She looked at the seal for a moment. She picked it up. The wax cracked cleanly. She unfolded the document inside. It was written in the formal language of court summoning, the specific, centuries-old construction that had no ambiguity in it by design, that existed precisely because kings had learned, at some point in the long history of kings, that messages that could be interpreted multiple ways tended to produce the worst possible interpretation, and act accordingly. This one was clear. She was required to attend a procedural border reassessment at Ashenfall, pertaining to the Ember Ridge territory's northern boundary. The date listed was 8 days hence. Her presence was formally requested by the Crown. She read it twice. Then she folded it with the same care she would give any official document and set it beside her cup. She finished her breakfast. She was thinking about the northern boundary of Ember Ridge, which had not changed in 60 years and which had no pending dispute with anyone, which meant that there was no procedural reassessment that required her attendance, which meant that the document was accurate in its form and entirely fictional in its stated purpose, which meant she was being summoned for a reason that the document would not and could not say. She knew what the reason was. She had known it was coming, in the part of her mind that tracked patterns without being asked to, since Corwin's message had arrived a week ago. A short, careful note from Ashenfall's high advisor, written in the kind of language that communicated respect without warmth and information without exposition, inquiring after the outcomes of the Southern Basin negotiations, and noting, in a final paragraph that was doing a great deal more work than its brevity suggested, that the court would be grateful for any intelligence she might be willing to share regarding the participation of Ironvale's king in the proceedings. She had written back with a factual summary of the session and no additional color. The summons was the response to that response. She was folding the document a second time when Doran appeared in the doorway. She had learned, in the 10 days she had been here, to read his arrivals by how he stood in doorways. When he came with purpose, he came directly into the room. When he came to interrupt something he was uncertain he had the right to interrupt, he stood at the threshold for a moment. He was standing at the threshold. "You received something," he said. "A summons from Ashenfall," she said. He was still for a moment. Then he came into the room and sat across from her, and she handed him the document without being asked, because there was no version of this conversation that benefited from withholding information he would figure out in 30 seconds anyway. He read it. She watched him read it. His face was very composed while he read, which she had come to understand was not flatness or suppression but concentration. He looked like this when he was working through the flow model too, when he was giving something his full attention. He gave the summons his full attention. Then he folded it and set it down between them with the precision of a man setting down something that needed to be thought about before it was touched again. "The northern border of Ember Ridge," he said, "has had no dispute in 60 years, she said. "No," he said. A pause. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She looked at him. In 23 years of her life, she could count on one hand the number of times someone had asked her that question with this precise quality. Not "what should you do," not "what are you going to do," not the implicit "what do I need you to do," but "what do you want?" It was a question with so much space in it that it took her a moment to understand how to inhabit it. "I want to stay," she said. and the word came out before she had finished deciding on it, which told her something about where she actually was on the question. I want to finish the documentation on the Eastern Flow model, and I want to write the final recommendation for the Basin Council, and I want— She paused, because the next thing was true, and she had been not saying it for 10 days, and perhaps saying it would make it less manageable. But she had always been a person who preferred the truth to the version that was easier. I want to not go back to a room where someone is going to use the official language of authority to remind me of something that the official language was already used to do once. She watched him hear this. She watched the slight change in his face as the meaning settled, not the words, which were clear enough, but the weight under the words. The specific character of what had been done to her in that hall and what kind of room was now requesting her return. He did not say anything for a moment. "You are not required to go," he said. "A royal summons is a request that carries significant social weight," he said. "It is not, in the absence of an active legal matter, enforceable. A border dispute that does not exist cannot compel attendance from a person who is not a court official." His voice was very even. "You are not a court official. You are a private member of a border pack who has been visiting Ironvale territory in a professional capacity." He looked at her. "What you do with the summons is your decision." She thought about this. She thought about what it meant to ignore a summons from Kalen Voss. Not personally, not in terms of what it said about him or her or the particular shape of what had happened between them on the Blood Moon, but practically, in terms of what it would cost Ember Ridge in future. Her father's relationship with Ashenfall was delicate. The pack depended on access to northern trade routes that passed through Ashenfall territory. She was not, in this situation, a private person. She was the daughter of a lord whose territory was not large enough to afford the consequences of a public slight to the crown. She was not sure ignoring the summons was possible, but she was certain that the frame in which she responded to it was hers to choose. "I am going to send a response," she said. "I will indicate that I am finishing a professional matter in Ironvale, and that I will present myself at Ashenfall upon its conclusion." She looked at him. "Which gives me another week, at least, if the final documentation takes the time it should take." The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile. "The near relative of one. The final documentation," he said, "should absolutely take the time it should take." "It is important work," she said. "Very important," he agreed. And the gravity in his voice was completely genuine, and also not entirely about the documentation. She picked up the summons. She wrote her response that afternoon. A formal, courteous document that was everything a response to a royal summons should be. Respectful of the request, clear about her current professional obligations, and entirely free of anything that could be quoted as defiance. It was the most careful thing she had written in a long time. It was also, underneath the careful language, the first time since the Blood Moon ceremony, that she had done something that was purely her own decision, rather than a response to something that had been done to her. It felt different. Not loud, not dramatic, just different. The specific, quiet difference between being acted upon and acting. She sent it with that afternoon's post. Owen, when he read the summons and the response, said nothing for a long time. Then, "He is coming here." "He may," she said. "He is coming," Owen said. She did not argue. "And you are going to let this week be what it is," Owen said, which was not a question, but was offered in the tone of a man who was making certain that the person he cared about most was not moving toward something without having looked at where she was going. "I am not moving toward anything recklessly," she said. "I am finishing work that I started." "And?" She was quiet for a moment. "And I am in a place where the work is valued, and the person doing it is valued, and I am not ready to leave that yet." She met his eyes. "That is all it is." Owen held her gaze for a long moment. "All right," he said. He did not say anything else about it. That evening, Doran took her to the eastern boundary. Not to see the river, though the river was there, but to see the treaty stones. They rode out in the late afternoon when the light was going low and golden, and the hills on the horizon were the particular shade of amber that autumn made of everything here. The stones were older than the kingdoms. They had been here before Ironvale was Ironvale, before the territories had names, carved by people who had understood that the simplest agreements were the ones most likely to be kept. Not complex legal architecture, but the plain statement of what was true. This is the water. This is whose it is. This is what it asks in return. Doran dismounted and walked to the stones without explaining them. He ran his hand across the carvings. She watched him do it and felt, in a way she could not entirely account for, that this was something private she was being allowed to see. Not a performance of his connection to his territory, but the actual thing. The genuine, unguarded relationship between a man and the place he was responsible for. She had not been holding her breath. She only knew she had been holding it because she finally exhaled. He turned. He looked at her in the amber light. "You do not have to go to Ashenfall," he said, one more time, quietly. Not as instruction and not as suggestion, but as the plainest statement of a truth he was putting in front of her, and leaving entirely for her to do with as she chose. She looked at the stones. She looked at him. "I know," she said. The sun went down over the hills. They rode back in the dark, and the horses knew the road, and the lights of the Ironvale settlement appeared ahead of them in a long, warm scatter against the black of the evening. And Lyra Ashwood rode toward them and did not think, for the whole of that ride, about anything except the cold, clean air, and the sound of the horses, and the fact that she was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely in the place where she was. He arrived without a letter. That was the thing Lyra heard first, not that Kalen Voss was in Ironvale territory, not that the Alpha King of Ashenfall had crossed into a foreign kingdom without a formal diplomatic exchange, but that there had been no letter, no advance notice, no protocol, no delegation of officials preceding him to smooth the terrain. He had simply ridden. She was reviewing the final flow model documentation when Foster appeared in the doorway of the records room, looking as though he had swallowed something difficult. "There are riders at the main gate," Foster said, "from Ashenfall." She did not look up from the document. "How many?" "8, with—" He stopped. She looked up. "With the king," Foster said. She set down her pen. She had known it was coming. Owen had told her it was coming, 5 days ago, with the certainty of a man who had been watching powerful people make consequential decisions for long enough to recognize the pattern. She had not argued with him. She had simply kept working, and gone out with Doran to the eastern stations to walk the measurement points with the record-keeper Aldous, who turned out to be a small, precise woman in her 50s, with the best eye for data anomaly Lyra had ever encountered in a non-professional context. And she had finished the documentation, and she had sent the formal recommendation to the Basin Council, and she had done all of the things she had said she was going to do. She had also, in the evenings, sat with Doran in the small room adjacent to the meeting hall and talked. Not about water, not about flow models or political situations or the shape of the work they had both been doing. They had talked about other things, about what it was like to be responsible for a territory's people in the specific, daily sense that had nothing to do with ceremony or title, and everything to do with whether the roads were repaired and the harvests were managed, and the pups born in winter had adequate shelter. They had talked about the things they had read, which overlapped considerably. They had talked about the places they had not yet been, and the ones they had been to, and what the difference was between a place you visited and a place you understood. She had been learning the difference between a man who summons and a man who asks. She had been learning it in such clear and specific detail that she had stopped needing to frame it in terms of comparison. "Where is Doran?" she asked. "In the main hall. He received word 20 minutes ago." Foster paused. "He said to tell you." She gathered the documentation she had been working on, squared the papers, set them with the other completed files. She stood. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall that she had been ignoring for 12 days, and decided she looked exactly as she was, like a person who had been working hard in a room for 2 weeks and had not been thinking about her appearance. She went to the main hall. Doran was standing at the hall's large window when she came in. He was looking at the courtyard below, where the Ashenfall riders had dismounted and were being attended to by Foster's staff, with the wary efficiency of a household that was accustomed to diplomatic complexity. He did not turn when she entered, which meant he had heard her come in and was giving her a moment. She came to stand beside him. Below, in the courtyard, 8 riders in Ashenfall colors and 1 king. Kalen Voss looked, from this distance, exactly as he had looked in the Great Hall of Ashenfall on the night of the Blood Moon ceremony. That quality of carved presence, of space reorganizing itself. He was speaking to one of his riders, and even from above, even at distance, the focus of his manner was visible. He was not looking at the building. He was not looking at the windows. He was looking at the courtyard gate. "You do not have to see him," Doran said. He said it without turning from the window. He said it in exactly the tone she had come to expect from him, the tone that offered without pressing, that stated without insisting, that put the choice entirely in her hands and then stayed out of the way of her making it. "I know," she said. She had been saying "I know" a great deal lately. She had discovered, in saying it, that it was the truest thing she said. She did know, more than she had in years, what she wanted, and what she did not want, and what she was prepared for, and what she was not. "But I am going to see him," she said. Doran turned his head and looked at her. Because ignoring him resolves nothing, and changes nothing, she said. And because I have spent enough of my life being in the position of something that happened to someone else. I would rather be the person who decides. She looked at the courtyard. He came here. I am going to find out why. A pause. I will be in the East Room if you need anything, Darren said. She nodded. She went downstairs. She met Kaelin in the receiving corridor, not the formal hall, which would have made it a diplomatic event, but the narrower stone corridor that connected the courtyard entrance to the main building, which made it simply two people standing in the same space. He looked different outside his own palace. Not smaller. He did not have the quality of shrinking in unfamiliar spaces, but different, in the way that familiar things always look different when you see them out of their usual context. He was still the same configuration of height and presence and gray eyes, but the architecture of Ashenfall was not behind him, and the court of Ashenfall was not around him, and the weight of his position was something he was carrying rather than something the room was holding for him. She waited. You did not come, he said. I sent a response, she said. I indicated I would attend when my professional obligations here were concluded. They were not yet concluded. They are now, she said. I finished the documentation this morning. He was quiet for a moment. I came, he said, because I needed to see you. She looked at him, carefully, with the same quality of attention she had given the survey documents, the flow model, the treaty stones, the attention that did not assume, that read what was actually there rather than what she expected to find. Why? She asked. Because I made a calculation, he said. On the night of the ceremony, a calculation about what was necessary, and what was affordable, and what the correct balance between them was. I was accurate about several of the variables. His voice had the quality it always had, controlled, deliberate, each word placed. I was not accurate about all of them. Which ones? He looked at her directly. You. The corridor was cold and quiet and very still. I listed your formal position, he said. Your rank, your political weight, your treaty connections, the things you were not. He paused. I did not look at what you were. Another pause. I have been corrected on this by events. She felt the pull of anger, not hot, but the clean, cold variety that arrived when you were entirely clear about what you were angry about. You have been corrected by events, she said. Yes. Meaning you heard about the basin dispute. Yes. And Ironvale. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. And so now that you have information about what I am capable of, the calculation has changed. He held her gaze. Yes. And you rode here without a letter, without protocol, without any of the preparation you would normally consider necessary for a diplomatic action in a foreign territory, because the calculation has changed. Yes, he said, and his voice was steady, and there was something in it that she had seen once before, for only a moment, on the night of the blood moon, that small, older, less controlled thing that lived under the calculation and was not part of it. No, she said. He stopped. No, she said again, more quietly. Not because of the calculation. Not because I have done things that have made me useful enough to be worth reconsidering. I was worth considering when I walked into your hall on the blood moon. The math was not different then. I was not different then. What was different then was that you had not bothered to look. Something moved in his face. It moved more slowly this time. It stayed longer. I know, he said. And I need you to understand, she said, that I understand why you made the decision you made. I understand the pressures of your position. I understand that governing a kingdom requires a kind of calculation that ordinary life does not. I am not telling you that you were wrong to have those considerations. She kept her voice even and clear. I am telling you that what you chose to see and what you chose not to see was yours. Not fate, not politics, yours. Yes, he said, quietly. And that what happened afterward, she paused, was also mine. The southern basin, the flow model, this. She did not gesture toward the building, toward Darren, toward the 12 days she had spent here. She did not need to. I did not do any of it to prove something to you. I did it because it needed doing and I was there, and those are the only reasons I have ever needed. He was watching her. I know, he said, for the third time. She looked at this king who had stood in front of her and made his calculation, and spoken the ancient words, and walked back to his dais, and resumed his evening. And she looked at him now, standing in an unfamiliar corridor in someone else's territory, without his court, without his protocol, without the architecture that held his position in place. And she saw, finally and fully, what Corwin had told her in the courtyard of Ashenfall on the night of the ceremony. that he was very good at calculating what things cost, and sometimes less good at calculating which currency. He had paid in the wrong currency. He was here because he knew it. But the bill did not work in reverse. "You should not have come," she said. "Not like this. Not now." She kept her eyes on his. "And not because I want you to suffer, that is not what this is, but because whatever you came here to say or do or offer, the answer that was true on the night of the blood moon is still true now. The scar on my wrist is permanent. The formal words you spoke are permanent. And the things that have happened since," she steadied her voice, "are not unwritten by your arriving here." He was completely still. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, "Go back to Ashenfall," she said. "Go back and govern your kingdom. You are very good at it. It needs you." She paused. "You were right that your kingdom needs a queen with weight in every court. You should find her." Another pause. "But you should look at the whole picture this time." She turned. She walked back toward the main hall, toward the east room where Doran was waiting, toward the documentation she had finished, and the work she had done, and the 12 days of being in a place where what she was enough. Behind her, she heard him breathe. She did not turn around. The corridor held the sound for a moment. Then she was through the door, and it was behind her, and she was in the warm light of the building she had been working in, and in the east room, she could see through the open door that Doran was sitting at the table with a book and a cup of something warm, reading, not waiting, simply present, available but not pressuring, there but not demanding. And the distinction between these two things was so profound, and so simple, and so completely clear, that she stood in the doorway for a moment and just let herself understand it. Then she went in. She sat across from him. He looked up. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He turned a page. She picked up the nearest document and read. Outside, in the corridor, and then in the courtyard, and then on the road north, Kalen Voss went back the way he had come, and the gate of Ironvale closed behind him, and the territory settled back into its ordinary quiet. The Grand Accord had not convened in 7 years. It was the kind of gathering that only happened when the individual machinery of separate territories had produced enough overlap and enough tension that the only practical solution was to put every significant figure in the same room at the same time and deal with the collective weight of it at once. There were treaty renewals due. There were 3 border adjustments pending formal ratification. There were 2 succession matters that required multilateral acknowledgement, and there was the matter of the Southern Basin Water Agreement, which had been signed and was now ready for formal recognition by all the territories whose interests it affected. It was held at the Accord Hall in the Central Territory, a building that had been standing for 200 years and had been expanded 4 times, and which smelled, in the way of buildings expanded 4 times by 4 different governments, of very old stone and the particular mixture of ambitions that had accumulated in its walls. Lyra arrived with the Ironvale delegation. This was not something she had planned, and it was something she had thought about carefully before agreeing to. Doran had asked her, formally and plainly, to attend as part of the Ironvale official party, not as a representative of Ember Ridge, which she also was, but as the lead author of the Eastern Flow model documentation that was being presented at the Accord as part of the Basin Agreement ratification. It was an accurate description of her role. The work had been done under Ironvale auspices, and the documentation bore Ironvale's formal seal alongside hers. She had asked for a day to think about it. She had thought about it carefully. Then she had said yes, and she had meant it in the way she meant things, not reluctantly, not as a concession, but as a genuine choice made with clear eyes and a steady hand. She wore green. Not because it was Ironvale's color, it was not. Ironvale used gray and deep blue in its formal symbolism, but because green was the color she looked best in, and she had learned, sometime in the past weeks, that looking exactly as she was tended to be more useful than adapting herself to the room. She wore the silver ring that had belonged to her mother. She wore her hair braided and pinned. She looked like herself. The Accord Hall on the day of the main session was full in the particular way that important rooms get full, not just with people but with the weight of what those people represented. The accumulated significance of territory and history and alliance sitting in every chair and standing in every aisle and filling every corner with the specific texture of power concentrating in a space. She had walked into a room like this once before. She walked into this one differently. Owen was in the gallery above, with Clara and Pip. She had seen them when she came in. Clara had given her a look that communicated something she would need a private conversation to fully unpack. Owen had simply nodded, which from Owen was the equivalent of a considerable speech. She took her place at the Ironvale table. Doran was beside her, and to her left was Ironvale's formal legal advisor, and to his left were the territorial representatives and their staff. It was a large delegation. She had been part of large delegations before, technically. She had attended court events as her father's daughter, had stood in rooms where her family's name was on the attendance list, and her personal presence was an afterthought beside it. This was different. She was here because of what she had done, not what name she had been born into, not what her father's rank entitled her to, what she had done, specifically, with her own hands and her own mind in a records room in the early hours of the morning with a candle burning and a stack of old documents and the question that no one else had thought to ask. Aldis's name was on the documentation too. She had insisted on it. Garrett opened the formal proceedings, and he did it with considerably more confidence than he had displayed at Three Bridges. Apparently being part of a successfully concluded negotiation had agreed with him. The territorial representatives introduced themselves and their matters in the formal order. The Basin Agreement was presented by Holt, who presented it exactly as it deserved to be presented. Plainly, accurately, with the data speaking for itself rather than requiring embellishment. Lyra presented the flow model documentation. She had given formal presentations before, in front of her father's pack council, in front of the Ember Ridge Water Committee, in front of Foster's assembled delegations at Three Bridges. She had always been good at presentations because presentations were the same problem as everything else she was good at. You had information, and you had an audience, and your job was to build the most efficient and accurate path between them. She built it. She walked the accord through the 12-year data set, the discovery of the upstream diversion's unreported impact, the corrected baseline calculations, and the proposed monitoring framework. She cited Aldis directly, by name and by station, as the source of the primary data. She was clear about what the model showed and what it did not show. She was clear about the remaining uncertainties, and what further measurement would be needed to resolve them. When she finished, there was a brief silence that had a specific quality, the silence of a room that has just received information it needs to think about. Garrett asked 3 questions. She answered all 3. The representative from the Northern Territories asked 2 more. She answered those 2. Then the room moved to the next item on the agenda, and she sat back in her chair, and the work was done. Holt, from across the hall, met her eyes briefly, and inclined her head. Lyra inclined hers back. The proceedings continued for most of the day. Treaty renewals, border ratifications, the routine and necessary business of territories that shared a world and needed, periodically, to acknowledge the specific terms of that sharing. Lyra followed all of it. She was good at following all of it. She had read the briefing materials twice. It was in the late afternoon, in the pause between the formal sessions and the dinner at which the agreements would be formally signed, that she became aware of Kalen. She had known he was in the building. Of course he was. He was the Alpha King of Ashenfall, the largest territory in the central region, and no accord of this significance convened without him. She had registered his arrival in her peripheral awareness when the Ashenfall delegation came in, the way you register a known quantity without needing to examine it directly. But in the pause, when the delegates were rising and speaking and moving in the informal manner of people between formal events, she felt his gaze. She did not turn toward it immediately. She finished what she was saying to Ironvale's legal advisor. She took a drink of water. She allowed herself to be in the room, completely, without preemptively preparing for anything. Then she turned. He was at the far end of the hall. He was watching her. Not with the calculating assessment she had seen in the great hall of Ashenfall on the blood moon. Not with the arrived-too-late quality of his visit to Ironvale. This was different. Quieter. Something that had no agenda in it. She held his gaze for a moment. She did not smile and she did not look away. She simply looked at him with the same clear-eyed attention she had always given things that deserved to be looked at honestly. Then Darren appeared at her shoulder. He had come from the direction of the western tables, where he had been in conversation with 2 northern lords, and he came the way he always came, without announcement, without ceremony, with the simple directness of a man who knew where he was going and went there. He stood beside her. She became aware, from across the hall, of the specific moment when Kalen registered it. Darren said, quietly, near her ear, "The Northern delegation has agreed to include the monitoring framework in the treaty renewal. The advisor wants to discuss the timeline. Tell him the first measurement cycle needs to begin before spring thaw," she said. "If we wait until summer, we lose the best data window." "I told him that," Doran said. "He is concerned about staffing. Aldis can train 2 people in 3 weeks. I have seen how she works." She turned from Kalen's direction without it being a performance, simply because the conversation required her attention. "I can send him her contact information this evening." "That would be useful," Doran said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, not looking across the hall, in the same even tone, "He is watching you." "I know," she said. "Does it concern you?" She thought about it honestly, because that was the only way she knew how to think about things. "No," she said, "it does not concern me." Doran nodded, once, and went back to the northern delegation. She turned toward the western tables where the signing documents were being prepared, where Holt was reading through the final language with the focused attention of someone who had waited 30 years for a river agreement and was not going to rush the last 5 minutes of it. The dinner that followed the formal agreements was the kind of dinner that Accord events always produced, considerable in size and formality, organized in a way that required everyone to be present without requiring them to address the things that most needed addressing, and therefore excellent for the management of situations that were not fully resolved, and for which the resolution could not be rushed. She was seated at the Ironvale table, 6 places from Doran on one side and Holt on the other, which was a configuration she had not arranged but which suited her. The table was large. Kalen was at the Ashenfall table across the room. She was aware of him the way you are aware of a fact you have already accounted for, present, registered, not requiring further attention. She ate her dinner. She spoke with Holt about the spring implementation schedule. She spoke with the Basin Council's new representative about the monitoring stations. She spoke with a woman from the Central Territory who had been involved in a different water rights matter 5 years ago, and who had heard, from several directions, about the Ember Ridge work at 3 Bridges, and who had opinions about it that she had apparently been waiting for an opportunity to share, and which turned out, once shared, to be both perceptive and genuinely interesting. She realized at some point during the dessert course, having a good time. Not despite everything. Not in the complicated way of someone who is having a good time in the shadow of something difficult. Simply, directly, in the uncomplicated way of a person who is doing what they are good at, in the company of people who are interested in what she knows, eating adequate food in a room with sufficient warmth. She had forgotten that this could feel like this. Not easy, nothing was easy, not really, and she would not have wanted it to be. But possible, clear, hers. After dinner, as the formal portion of the evening concluded, and the delegates moved into the smaller rooms for the informal conversations that were often the most significant part of any Accord gathering, Doran came to find her. He stood beside her in the doorway of one of the side rooms. "The Northern Advisor is satisfied with the monitoring timeline," he said. "He has agreed to fund the second measurement station." "Good," she said. "There is something else," he said. She looked at him. His face had the careful quality it sometimes had when he was about to say something important and was being precise about how he said it. "I would like you to come back to Ironvale," he said. "Not for the water model, not for a specific professional matter." He kept his eyes on her face, steady and direct and entirely free of performance. "I would like you to come back because Ironvale is," he paused, choosing the word with the precision she had come to expect, "better when you are in it. And because I am better when you are in it, and because I would like to find out, if you are willing to find out with me, what that means going forward." The side room was warm and quiet. She looked at him. She looked at the face of a man who had asked rather than summoned, who had shown rather than told, who had put evidence in front of her for weeks and then put the question in front of her and stepped back from it and let her reach the answer herself. She thought about the letter she had burned. She thought about the river at 3 Bridges and the treaty stones on the eastern boundary, and Aldous measuring the water in an unmapped station for 18 years because it needed doing. She thought about the kind of answer that was not built from what someone felt in a single dramatic moment, but from what was true, repeatedly and plainly, and without requiring anyone to be larger than they were. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time in all the weeks she had known him, he smiled, not a near relative of one, not the controlled movement of a mouth deciding to express something. A real smile, with all of him in it, the unguarded kind, the kind that happened when a person got the answer they had not been certain they would get. She filed it away. She would be taking it home with her. She would be coming back. Across the room, through the open doorway of the main hall, she could see the Accord delegates moving in their various directions, the evening concluding in the gradual and slightly reluctant way of evenings that have held a great deal. She could see Corwin at the edge of the Ashenfall gathering, speaking with someone she did not recognize, his expression the same careful, unrevealing attentiveness it had been in every room she had ever seen him in. She did not see Kalen. She did not look for him. That was the point, not the triumph of not looking, but the genuine absence of the need to. She was standing in a doorway with a man who had asked her what she wanted and then done something about it, and she had said yes, and the whole weight of what the yes meant was in front of her like a country she had been looking at from a distance and was now, finally, about to enter. It was new. It was large. It was hers. She turned back to Dourin. "The spring thaw," she said, "is 4 months away. I should be in Ironvale for at least 2 of them before the first measurement cycle." He nodded seriously, matching her tone. "That is a reasonable assessment. I will need to go home to Ember Ridge first. There are things I have left unattended. Of course. And I will need to speak with my father. Naturally. He is going to have many opinions." "I expect so." She looked at him. "And you are going to be entirely unbothered by all of this." "I have governed a large territory for 11 years, he said. "I have negotiated with people significantly more difficult than Lord Aldous Ashwood." The near relative of a smile came and went. "I am not easily bothered." She laughed. Real and clear, with nothing complicated underneath it. The Accord Hall echoed it back. The throne room of Ashenfall had a crack in the floor. It had been there for 30 years, running diagonally across the 4th panel of stone from the entrance, a hairline break in the granite that no one had repaired because repairing it would have required moving the room's central carpet, and everyone had agreed, in the particular unspoken way that institutional decisions get made, that the carpet was not worth moving. Kaelin had walked over that crack every day for 9 years. He walked over it now. The room was empty in the late afternoon. The last council session of the day had concluded an hour ago, and the advisors and lords and secretaries had dispersed to their various other functions, and the throne room was doing what it always did when it was empty, being large and cold and acoustically unforgiving in the way of spaces that were built to hold the voices of many, and went strange when they held only one. He stood in the center of the room. He had come back from the Accord 4 days ago. The return had been smooth. His delegation had ridden in good time, and the city had welcomed its king in the ordinary way. And the council had been briefed on the Accord outcomes, and the treaty renewals had been filed, and the border ratifications were in the process of being processed by the relevant offices. Everything was in order. Everything was as it should be. He stood in the throne room and looked at the door. It was the same door she had walked through 7 months ago. Blood Moon night. The candles had been lit and the floor had been shining with reflected gold, and 300 people had been watching the ceremony that happened once in a generation, and she had stood 12 feet from the dais with her spine straight, and her hands loose, and her face entirely composed, and he had looked at her, and felt the pull, and made his calculation. He thought about the Accord. He thought about the moment when he had seen her rise to present the flow model documentation, the quality of her presence at the front of the room, not performed or borrowed but entirely her own, the way she had fielded the questions from the Northern representative, with the same economy and accuracy she brought to everything. He had watched the room shift toward her the way rooms did when someone said something that was both true and illuminating, and he had understood, with the precision that was his particular quality, that this was not a new thing. This had always been there. He had looked at a partial picture. He went to the window. Ashenfall at dusk was the same it had always been. The long light going amber across the rooftops, the river silver and slow in its channel through the city, the smoke from the lower workshops rising in the still autumn air. His city. The thing he had organized his entire life around. The thing for which he had made every calculation, including the calculation that now stood in his chest like a stone, that had no corner sharp enough to hurt in any one place, and no corner rounded enough to stop hurting entirely. Corwin came in without being called. He had been doing this for 22 years. Kaelin had long since stopped being surprised by it. "The Ironvale Diplomatic Register has listed a new official appointment," Corwin said, standing a respectful distance from the window. "Miss Lyra Ashwood of Ember Ridge, as Senior Water Treaty Advisor to the Ironvale Crown." Kaelin did not turn from the window. "When?" he asked. "The announcement was made yesterday." A pause. "It also notes that her formal engagement to King Dauren Malkiel is expected to be declared before the winter solstice." The window was cold. The autumn light was very still. He thought about the word engagement and let it settle in him, and did not perform a reaction, because he was alone and there was nothing useful to be performed, and the most honest version of himself, the version that existed under the calculations and the governance and the trained restraint, was simply a man standing at a window learning something that he had made possible and could not take back. He was not surprised. He had known, in the records room corridor at Ironvale, standing in the stone passage with her eyes steady on his face and her voice entirely clear, telling him exactly what she thought, and exactly why, and exactly what she would not do. He had known it then. She had closed a door so cleanly that there was not even a draft. He had come back to Ashenfall and gone through the motions of the council and the treaty filings and the ordinary business of a kingdom, and the crack in the throne room floor had been there every morning when he walked over it, and the view from the window had been the same view, and everything had been in order. "She is good," he said, not to Corwin specifically, to the window, to the city, to the accurate record of things. "She is exceptional," Corwin said. "You knew." "On the night of the ceremony," Corwin said. "I did not know the specifics, but I knew the type." A pause. "I have been watching people for a very long time, and there is a kind of person who does not need the room to confirm what they are, because they already know it and are simply going about their business regardless. You can always identify them afterward, because they are the ones who have gone somewhere interesting by the time everyone else has caught up." Kaelin was quiet. "She told you what you were doing wrong," Corwin said, "at Ironvale." "Yes." "Was she right?" A long pause. "Yes," Kaelin said. He turned from the window. The throne room was still empty, still large, still cold in the particular way of ceremonial spaces that were built for occasions rather than occupancy. The crack in the floor ran its diagonal across the fourth stone panel. The carpet lay over it the way it always lay, covering the fracture without correcting it. "The Succession Council has been asking," Corwin said. "I know. They will continue to ask. I know that too." Corwin stood with his arms loose at his sides, which was his version of patient attendance, the stance that said "I am here" without specifying what he was here for. Kaelin had always valued this about him. He had always valued the presence of people who did not require him to explain the whole of his internal situation before they would stay in the room with him. "I have been governing this kingdom for 9 years, Kaelin said. "I have made decisions with the full information available to me, and I have made decisions without it, and I have made decisions where the information was complete, and the decision was still wrong, and I have learned from all of them." He looked at the throne at the far end of the room, which was the piece of furniture that said the most about what he had inherited, and what he had built, and what he would be required to continue building regardless of any other consideration. "I am going to find a queen who is capable of more than her formal position suggests," he said, "and I am going to look at the whole picture this time." Corwin was quiet for a moment. "That is a significant commitment," he said, "given that identifying such a person requires the very quality of observation you have just acknowledged was lacking." Kaelin looked at him. "I am not being critical," Corwin said. "I am noting the difficulty of the undertaking." "I know it is difficult," Kaelin said. "Difficult is not the same as impossible." "No," Corwin agreed. "It is not." He gave Corwin one more look. "Was she?" He stopped. Corwin waited. "Was she all right?" Kaelin said. "At the Accord. Was she all right?" Corwin considered the question with his usual precision. "She was better than all right," he said. "She was, by every observation I could make, exactly where she was supposed to be." A pause, which I acknowledge is not an answer that simplifies your situation. "No," Kaelin said, "but it is an accurate one." "It is." He walked toward the door. "The council has sent the trade proposal from Ironvale," Corwin said, to his back. Kaelin stopped. He had asked for it. He had asked for it on the night he returned from the Accord, before the news about the diplomatic appointment, before anything. He had sat in his study and gone through the day's correspondence and then asked, quietly and without explanation, for the current state of the trade proposal from Ironvale's Water Treaty Office. It was practical. Ironvale and Ashenfall had overlapping interests in the Northern River system, and the new water framework that Lyra's documentation had established was going to change the calculus of those interests considerably, and he needed to understand the terms before the territory relationships shifted in ways he had not accounted for. This was the correct reason to request the trade proposal. It was also true that the trade proposal had been prepared by the senior water treaty advisor to the Ironvale Crown, and that every line of it would bear the specific quality of her thinking, and that reading it would be, among other things, the act of continuing to understand what he had failed to see when he should have been looking. He was going to read it very carefully. "Put it in my study," he said. "I will deal with it tonight." "Yes," Corwin said. Kaelin walked through the throne room door. The crack in the floor was behind him. He did not look back at it. He walked to his study, and the fire was lit there, and the desk was clear, and the evening outside was going from amber to deep blue in the way that autumn evenings went, quickly and with conviction, as though they had been waiting all day for the right light, and were not going to waste it once it arrived. He sat at his desk. He thought about Lyra Ashwood, standing in the Accord Hall with her spine straight and her hands loose, and the room shifting toward her like water finding the lowest point, which was not the lowest point at all but the truest one, the place the water always went because it had been measuring the gradient since the beginning, and it knew. He thought about what it cost to miscalculate a gradient. He thought about what it required to correct the error after the fact. He thought about Ashenfall and what it needed, and what he had promised it, and what it meant to govern well rather than simply correctly, and whether those two things were always the same, and what it looked like when they were not. The trade proposal arrived. He opened it. The first page was a summary of the Eastern Flow Model's implications for the Northern Treaty Zones, clear, accurate, compressed into 3 paragraphs that gave him everything he needed to know about the data, and nothing extraneous. The second page was the specific proposal language. The third was the supporting technical documentation. He read all of it. He made notes. He was in the middle of the technical documentation, somewhere around the section on seasonal variance and the monitoring schedule, when he wrote a word in the margin and then stopped. The word was Aldous. He had written it because the documentation cited a record keeper of that name as the primary data source, and the citation was unusually specific. Not just the name but the station, the years of service, the exact measurement points she had added to the official system without being asked. It was a citation that did not have to be that specific. Most technical documents were not that specific about the people whose work they rested on. He stared at the word. Then he wrote, in the margin beside it, in his small and very controlled handwriting, "See the whole picture." He was not talking about the monitoring data. He turned the page. He kept reading. The fire burned on. Outside, Ashenfall went about its evening with the ordinary and continuous life of a city that did not require its king to be managing a crisis in order to continue. The streets lit, the river moving, the smoke rising, the 1,000 private lives in their 1,000 private configurations going about their business in the dark. Kalen Voss, Alpha King of Ashenfall, sat at his desk and read a trade proposal that had been written by a woman he had let go, and made his notes, and did his work, and did not, for the rest of that night, allow himself to stop. Because work was what he had. Work was what he was good at. Work was the thing that remained when you had made every other calculation and found, in the honest accounting of it, that the currency you had been measuring in was not the currency that mattered most. He was going to do better. He was going to look at the whole picture. He turned the last page. In Ironvale, 4 days' ride north, the river ran at exactly the rate that 12 years of careful measurement had predicted it would run. Somewhere along its eastern bank, in an unmapped station that was about to become very well mapped, a woman named Aldous was recording the evening's flow in the careful handwriting she had been using for 18 years. Somewhere in Ironvale's halls, 2 people were doing the quiet, ordinary work of beginning something that had no dramatic origin and no moment of thunder. Only the slow accumulation of evidence that this was the right thing, the accurate thing, the thing that built itself on data that neither of them had been afraid to look at directly. The river would be measured in the morning. The records would be kept. The work went on.